Leadership is a central component in the narrative of all teachers. Students look to the teacher to set the tone and direction in the learning environment. The effective teacher weaves the story in the way knowledge, skills, relationships, and the ability to reflect empower all. American researchers John Clenadon and Michael Connolly describe this narrative journey in terms of place, the personal and social dimension, and how our experiences of the present are shaped by the past and give us a window into the future. As a new graduate in 1981, Michael Johnston commenced at MLMC, and via a successful leadership path over 38 years had a profound impact on the students and vision of the college. Michael espoused the Mercy core values of reverence, whereby he understood the sacredness and dignity of every person, commitment, justice in fostering good relationships, stewardship and integrity. Overarching all, the Mercy charism of determination, vision, humour and practicality Michael characterised in his leadership. Say what you like. I never left that place, not altogether. Anyhow, it strikes me, in all fairness, some interchange occurred. There'd still be the same old sense of falling backward into time, as if the dizziness over, the turf steady, the sky pinned back at last. We might look round and find the present ready to imitate the past.
So Michael, this is the campus where you first started at the college as a new graduate.
It looks very different these days since the rooms have been refurbished, which was now a few years ago. This was probably the room where I first taught Alison Mann, as she was then, now Schluter. She did accuse me one day of slamming the door in her face, but I don't think that ever really happened. This part of the school though is a fascinating place, I think. It's the hub of year 7, 8 and 9, and my first memories here would have been of someone like Sister Philippa MacDonald. She ruled this place with an iron fist in the early days. And then the beautiful Leah Hill came on the scene, and she was very different. Not so pleasant memories are of doing yard duty in the quadrangle on a wet day, where there were probably around 600 to 700, maybe even more students all crammed into the one area. In those days they used to make them sit down on, they had those old wooden trestles. They used to have to sit down at lunchtime. Someone would be on a microphone telling them not to move until they finished their lunch, and they'd do it. I'm not sure how you go with it these days. I'm not sure how you go with it these days. My other memory of this wing is that, again teaching Year 9 geography, it was a springtime storm. It was probably November, getting towards the end of the school year, and you could see a storm building up over the hill there at Moorbark. So I was teaching geography, asked the kids to put the books down and watch the storm come in, and the storm literally came in. We had to abandon the room. There were hailstones the size of golf balls coming at parallel through the window. In the end, the actual wall buckled, and there was a gap that big between. You could see daylight. So we exited very quickly. As I was driving out here, I was thinking about that. As I got the last student to the door, as the hailstones were still coming through the door, one girl said, "I've forgotten my books, I've got to go back and get them." So she went inside. Can you imagine these days? They'd be going back in for their laptops and their mobile phones. They're really good for saying that.
Accompany us today, Terry. So it's lovely to have you walking around with us today. We need to acknowledge you because you came here when the school became co-educational to ensure that the boys had plenty of access to sports, and became famous as our senior weightlifting leader, and all sorts of amazing things happened.
They certainly did. We wondered what struck us when the boys arrived, but we sorted it out eventually. It was fun. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'm still mates with a lot of them. So,
and you're still mates with Michael, and you and Michael together coached the early football teams. I remember going to see a grand final at Princes Park. I think it was 1983.
Reunion here last year. Some of the boys that played in that team were at that reunion.
All right.
And the first thing they said to me was, "Do you remember that fight?" So, all these years later, a schoolboy grand final is still a highlight for them. And some of them went on to play some very good football at a high level, but the school grand final was still a highlight for them.
It was good. We had the numbers, and the boys loved it, and we were very good at it. So.
And to teach a bit of sport in those days was always good fun. It was pretty basic back then, but like anything, you made the most of what you had. And I think to work with the boys in particular at the sport, for some of them the classroom wasn't the happiest place during the course of a day. Get them out on a football ground or a cricket ground, and they were a different character altogether. So that was, again, another way, I think, to build relationship and connection with the boys. It was always good.
It certainly was. And, I'm still friends with a lot of them, so
Yeah.
which is good.
And you were a Collingwood football tragic, and Terry's not so happy about sharing the stage with somebody who barracks for Collingwood, I think.
One thing I'll say about Terry is that he is always very accepting of people, except Collingwood supporters. Never heard him say a bad word about anyone, except Collingwood supporters. But that's all right.
Well, it's very hard to find something good to say about them. That's the trouble.
And so, Michael, you and Terry play cricket together now as well, don't you?
So
Well, we hoped.
when you reach a certain age, you qualify for the so-called veterans cricket, and then you just go through various stages as you age. And we're both, as you can see, we're both aged very well. And over the years, we've played quite a deal of cricket together, with limited success, you might say, but that's all right. It's all good fun.
That's right. It's a pity you weren't coming up to Albury Wodonga with us, and we could use you.
Actually, as we talk about this, the memory of Pete Anderson comes back again, because you used to organise those games, the college staff against the Mount Evelyn veterans.
Oh yeah, that's right.
They were great games.
Yes.
The likes of Mark Evans and Pete Anderson, Gerard Carrick,
That's
some
right,
good cricketers in there.
It certainly was.
They were great times.
Yeah. Didn't someone break a foot or something?
I think Dave Banfield might have upset a couple. Yeah.
That's right. He was a bit slippery.
Yeah.
He's still here, I guess.
Michael, following the death of esteemed friend and colleague Glenys Heath, you were appointed Senior Master and took on the leadership of the senior school, and you had an office just here, as I remember. Do you want to tell us what that was like to take on that mantle?
I was fortunate to work with Glenys for 2 or 3 years before she lost the battle with cancer. I learnt a great deal from her in that time. You also work very closely with Glenys. You would describe it as a gentle form of leadership that she had, but boy, you didn't. Glenys she made me look tall, but boy, when she took on a 6'2" Year 12 boy, I know who came off second best every time. Yeah, she was a great role model for me, and as I say, I learnt a great deal from her during that time. And then I assumed that position and stayed in that for probably over 10 years, I think. And I think probably of the roles that I had, it was the one that gave me the greatest ability to connect with the students on a day-to-day basis. It was a leadership role in the school, but it was still very much a hands-on role. The deputy role sort of took you away from that a little bit. So the ability to work closely with the students, in particular the Year 12s, because they were based here in this building. So I'd see them on several times a day. And that was a great experience in terms of being able to work with them and to develop the sort of friendships and relationships with them that lasted well beyond school years as well.
Michael, as DP you conducted a number of assemblies in this venue. How did you convey your vision of leadership?
I suppose there, Trish, the ability to gather students on a regular basis, to me, just built the sense of connection with their school. If they don't ever gather as a group, I don't know they have that sense of being part of one community. So when this opened, it gave us that opportunity. But probably even better than that, when the Doyle Centre was completed. From virtually day one, we launched into full school assemblies. So you had 1,500 students there. I thought it was a great opportunity just to get students to understand they were part of a community, and then you could talk about what sort of community that was. Both these venues certainly gave us that chance. There's lots of schools of this size who probably couldn't be bothered with the logistics, or maybe didn't think it set the right tone if they gathered their students together, whereas I always felt here we were lucky, and to this day I still think whenever the full school gathers there's a real sense of shared experience in that. What do you do when you get them there? Probably any number of things. I always tried to make them realise that they were so lucky to be living in the country they live in, to appreciate that, to appreciate the opportunity they had to attend a school as good as this, and to make the most of that opportunity. So that would sort of sum up the general themes. Yeah, I think just to make the most of the opportunities they were given. Yeah.
And from this particular venue, we bade farewell to Neville Howe, a very good friend of both of us. He was a very special man, and I think particularly for the gentlemen, there was the secret men's business. I got invited to it once, but yes.
Forced you away.
No, I didn't force my way. It was a gentle invite. But can you talk about Neville, the two of you, and being part of that?
For those who don't know, Neville, I think Neville started the year before I did, and he was a great mentor and father figure to many people here at the school. He was recently arrived in Australia, having brought his family from South Africa, and the turmoil that was apartheid that was taking place in that country at that time. So, unbeknownst to me, as we would travel to and from work together, and unbeknown to me, I became, I think, his cultural attaché. He was desperately trying to learn about Australian lifestyle, and in the process he also taught me many things about teaching. I was also newly married at that point in time, and Nev also had many words of advice for young married men that have been passed on here from one generation to the next over time. He was a great man, as a mentor to many people, and it was a very sad occasion when he passed. Yeah, he was a great man. Looked after the hall after it was opened. He was the caretaker, and God help you if you did anything in there that Nev didn't know about.
And holds us in God's loving
Michael, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed today, along with three of your past students, Alison, Natalie and John Michael.
It's a pleasure, Trish, thank you.
And it's a pleasure for us too, to welcome you back after 38 years working at this school, to be sharing some of your story with us. And yours is an interesting story because your first connection with the Sisters of Mercy was when you went to St Coleman's in Shepparton.
Correct.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that experience?
St Coleman's and Sacred Heart were on opposite sides of the road. So you had the Mercy School on one side and the Maris Brothers on the other. Yeah, it was just that connection straight off. And at the higher levels of the school, the two schools combined for subjects. So there was always a temptation to try and do French in Year 10 just because that was the co-ed class. But needless to say, my French studies finished at the end of Year 10. And that was about it. So that was the connection, yeah. And little did I know that a few years later, they employed me.
And so you met your wife Sue at university, and you've had many happy years together, and for many years travelled and so on.
You're right. We met at uni. She was bonded to the education department at the time, which meant that you were required at the completion of your course to go and teach where they sent you. She went to Pyramid Hill, which is about 100 k's north of Bendigo and the driest part of the Victoria you could ever imagine. She was bonded for 3 years, so at the end of the first year she proposed to me so she could return to the city.
She could get out.
I keep reminding her that if it wasn't for me she'd be married to a farmer today. So that was the story there. And yeah, we settled here after I got the job, and it's been a great place to live and to raise our two children. And as you know, our two children attended Mount Lolita, and it was a great school for them as well.
You've had the pleasure, of course, of teaching these three, so that's why you invited them back as well. You've had a long career at this school, Michael. 38 years is a significant contribution to any community. Do you want to share some of that journey with us?
I suppose, and for the teacher also in this room, and yourself included, Trish, there are times in your career where you reflect on what it was that brought you into teaching. Probably not surprisingly, it's the impact that perhaps some teachers that you had as a student influenced, and no doubt the younger Maris brothers that I had in my final years of school were probably fairly influential. In my early days at high school, you were taught by the older Maris brothers, and they were fairly brutal. The younger ones were a breath of fresh air in that they were a generational change, and they were far more relatable. They made you enjoy learning, and I think that was probably, if I look back on it, I think that was probably the thing that brought me into teaching. I don't know that I'd ever been to Lilydale before I came out for the interview with Sister Beth on that day. In those days it was still very much an outer suburb, almost a country town on its own right. The first person I met was Jan Battolini, and I've just finished having a conversation with Jan Battolini now, so the survivors, you might say. Yeah.
So would you like to share some of the highlights of that journey, though?
I suppose the first thing is that I only have good memories of Mount Lilydale. Along the way there have obviously been events that are sad, you might say tragic, but I think that helps build a sense of community for the level of support that's offered to people at those times, and I think we see that in so many ways. Along the way I've been fortunate. A very wise man who'd been in education a long time once said to me, if you think you're at a good school, don't give it up easily. He said there's a few good schools and there's a lot of not so good schools, so if you think you're in a good one, stay. I've been fortunate in that different opportunities have opened up across that time, and that's probably the reason I stayed as long as I did.
So you had some significant colleagues, like Sister Beth, you've acknowledged, who interviewed you for your first position here. Probably Mr. Farrelly was also part of that interview panel, and maybe even Terry Harrison. And they formed a very strong unit with whom you worked in senior leadership. So can you share some of the memories there?
I suppose as I was thinking about what I'd say here today, I think the three that you've just mentioned, Sister Beth, Kevin Farrelly, Terry Harrison, in so many ways shaped the school for what it is today. I suspect at the time they appeared on the scene here, this was a small girls' school in the country. They transformed that into a modern co-educational secondary school that's just grown beyond what anyone could imagine. And I think the three of those shaped it for what it is today. Sister Beth was ahead of her time in so many ways. She was not only a great educator, she was also a very shrewd business person. And the great thing about Beth is you always knew where you stood with her. And to this day she continues to play some role in education, which I think is remarkable. Kevin was the Rock of Gibraltar. Very composed individual. Nothing ever flustered Kevin.
He had that expression, leave it to me.
But a highly intelligent man who had that wonderful ability just to get the job done. So he might have been like the duck that was paddling frantically under the water, but he never gave an impression of that. Terry Harrison, by a country mile, is probably the best school administrator I ever worked with. Not only did he have the educational vision and foresight, he had the practical ability to implement it. Terry put in place a system where essentially across 3 year levels there were 4 academic levels, and it allowed for enhancement, and it also allowed for consolidation for the kids that were struggling, and that was Terry's, I think, greatest contribution to the school. He was a great man.
And I've had to put in the comment from Mandy Brown and Jeff Pink that whilst you did some things effectively, you didn't have a good blackboard style, and your handwriting wasn't too much to expect.
Look, there's probably some in this room that...
What was wrong with that? What was wrong with that?
Oh, well, they didn't actually expand on what was wrong.
And look, the students that I currently teach would probably not disagree with that comment. I'm not sure it's improved a great deal, but that's all right. Modern technology has allowed me to overcome those deficiencies.
Well, he would have taught you, Alison. Could you read?
That was all right. We got by. As I say, modern technology's taken over.
Now, there have been great highlights, but moments of terrible sadness here, and your ability to empathise with staff, I think, has been greatly valued. Some of that journey has been difficult for all of us. Would you like to expand a little on some of that?
Probably as I look back across time, the one event that would stand out for anyone who was here at the time would have been the death of Elizabeth Calcagno on the Central Australian trip in 1993. That had a profound impact on so many people for so long. And to this day you still bump into, they're now young adults. One is the mum of a child who's currently in year 12, I think she'd be in. Her mum was also on the bus at the time. Had a profound impact, and the Calcagno family were remarkable through that. There was a period there where we seemed to be having funerals on a regular basis, didn't we, for staff members and for others in the community. Thankfully that passed. In those circumstances, I think that's where you see the best in people in terms of their willingness to empathise and to walk the journey with people, I think is the most important part.
But of course the school needs people in leadership roles, as you were in, to be able to ensure that happens. So it's interesting you mentioned Elizabeth's death and the bus accident. On Saturday night, John Michael's father was inducted into the Mercy Honour Roll, and one of the most outstanding achievements, it was said, was the way he was able to take on that job of counselling so many parents, students and so on. And he in turn acknowledged Adrian Riley and said what a stalwart Adrian had been. So it was a fairly emotional moment, really, wasn't it? Yes.
It would be, and to this day I recall clearly meeting the group upon their return. They flew into private charter at Essendon Airport and we met them there. It was just, it was the strangest feeling. But yes, again, Michael's work in the counselling team at that time, I think he probably spent a good deal of the remainder of that year in the Undercroft, which is where the kids were gathered at all different times. He was there.
Now, we've spoken earlier on about your espousal of the Mercy charism, and you visited Bagot Street, you went to many Mercy conferences as a DP. How did that influence the way you managed as a leader in this school?
For those who've been lucky enough to go to Dublin and to see the House of Mercy, it's a pretty powerful experience. And the people there obviously are very good at telling the story. The Mercy sponsored people to go on that, and I was lucky enough to go. It's coming up nearly 10 years ago now. It was a wonderful experience. You got to share it with other educators, but also people from the health sector. So it was sort of a cross career area. That was tremendous in that sense. The ones that probably meant the most, though, I think, were the national conferences where you got to hear a range of Mercy speakers from around the world. I recall vividly hearing an Irish nun, Sister Deirdre Mullen, an American nun by the name of Carol Rittner, and they were wonderful in terms of they coined it Mercy in action. And it was just the social justice side of, and I think that's probably what sets Mercy apart. I always believe that mercy is a verb, it's about doing it. And they were wonderful with that. And they're things you bring back into the school and try and implement programs there and encourage other people to follow. Yeah.
And as an educator, Michael, your focus was on economics, but I dare say you took a fairly strong social justice approach.
Always try and bring it in. The other one is legal studies. And Nat has probably been in many discussions in class where we've focused on those things, whether it be the plight of asylum seekers, just different government policies that seem to have an impact on low-income earners rather than that. Yeah, so I think part of our obligation as teachers is to always try and bring into the classroom that social justice idea. Otherwise, what is it that separates us from a non-Mercy school? I think that's part of our duty. But it's interesting, again, in thinking about that, I suppose in teaching, you have, from a career path point of view, you have a choice. You either go down the curriculum side of things or you do the pastoral care, wellbeing side of things. Very early on I made the decision, it was obvious to me that the pastoral care was the way to go. We did mention Sister Beth before. At one point she appointed me head of religious education.
Yes, I remember that.
And Beth had this wonderful knack of seeing things in people that perhaps others couldn't. And I thought, maybe. But the more I thought about it, the more I realised there was probably just a lack of applicants that particular year. So that didn't last very long. And then the wellbeing side well and truly kicked in. What did I enjoy most about that? I think was simply the ability to work with young people. And young people have a wonderful way of working out if you're not sincere, if you're not genuine. They see straight through it, whether that be in the classroom or any other role. So the ability to connect with them and to guide them in some way. I think working in schools, young people need boundaries, But at the same time, just like raising your own children, there are some things they need to be able to work out for themselves, and so long as that doesn't put them in any danger, I think that's not a bad thing either. Rather than just preach at them all the time, some things they have to come to their own realisation about.
And you're held in fairly high esteem, Michael, not just by your former students, but by parents. You had to deal a lot with parents, even with children who behaved very well in the class. You were still meeting with them on different bases at different times. How did you build up that strong relationship, given you were also part of the community, so you often ran into them at the shops and so on?
Yes, so living in the local area as well, there was no shortage of that, the incidental contact, so there were many parent-teacher interviews conducted after Mass and things like that. Yeah. Look, again, I suppose with parents, the main thing there is that the vast majority of parents trust the school because they made the decision in the first place to send their child here. They trust it in terms of keeping their children safe and providing the sort of education that they want. You spend the most amount of time with the parents of the difficult students. What do they want? Sometimes their own way, but they don't always get that. I think what they want is to know that their point of view has been listened to. And if they understand that, if they appreciate that, then in the end the decision's the easy one, so long as they know they've been heard. And that was sort of always sometimes it meant taking a fair bit of time, but that was the approach that I always adopted with the difficult situations.
So how did that affect your relationships with staff?
I don't know that it had a huge effect. I think the sense that the staff knew the style that I would adopt, and so long as they could see and the outcome was communicated to them, I don't know there was a huge issue there.
I was discussing earlier, though, with John Michael, an incident when he was in Year 12 and he decided to lead a protest against a class I was teaching because it was too feminist-based in its reading of text.
That is not. I don't think that would stand up in a court of law. Your allegation about what the protest.
But you did protest.
This is on the record, isn't it?
Yes, and you protested, and Michael supported 3 young men over the rest of my class.
I think that it was a great class full of vibrancy and ideas and critical thinking, and I think the 3 gentlemen that you're talking about at that point in time had a disagreement with the position that the class was being taken, so we thought we'd take a collective action and leave. And Mr. Johnston, we ran into him in the hallway and he said, "What are you boys doing?" One of the guys was a very tall lad, Stuart Ellicott, and said, "What are you boys up to?" And we explained our situation rationally, and you sided with us, I believe. You
obviously got a fair hearing.
You sided with us.
Obviously got a fair hearing. So, Trish, I'm confident that was dealt with appropriately.
You do have to realise the impression that this comes up on a regular basis.
Right. We move on. Have you got any more questions? Trish, where are we going?
Well, we're going to go to Alison for a little while. You're second on the list.
That's all right.
So, Alison, you've had the longest association with the school, having started here in prep. Maybe you can share a little bit of that experience.
So starting in prep, so as Michael said, it was...
I wasn't here then.
It wasn't far after that, though. No, it was a little while. So preps, it really was. It was still a boarding school then, but it was certainly getting smaller as far as the borders were concerned. We were the brown cows, of course, with our brown uniforms and our hats and our gloves. And it was Sister Gabrielle Jennings, who was the principal then. And so, yeah, we had a little room, and Leah Hill was, and Dora Browers were our teachers that I remember the most from that time. So, and then, yeah, so just moved through primary school, and then they decided to cut out the primary school, and they did it year by year by year. So I was one of the last years to go through. And then the boys came in 1975, is that correct? And the school continued to grow under Beth, as you said, a very canny businesswoman, and buildings went up everywhere, the uniform changed, the nature of the school changed, and I met Michael in Year 9, is when I first came across Michael.
So I believe he might have taught you geography.
He did teach me geography in Year 9. I can't say I remember much about geography, but I do remember being in a class with Mr. Johnston, and I remember the classes being very well organised.
Oh, I'm sure they were. Yes.
It was a baptism of fire.
I think it was second year, what did it be?
No, that was the first year.
Okay.
I had three, from memory, 3 Year 9 geography classes in that first year. So yeah, it was certainly a test of fire. And Beth was very canny. In those days, I'm not sure you get away with it today, but any applicant for a teaching position that was shortlisted had to actually come in and teach a lesson.
I had to do that too.
Yeah, I don't know that you get away with it today, but I think it's a great idea. So yeah, I don't know that I taught Year 9 geography as that practice lesson. Otherwise, this story may be very different if that was the case.
But later on, you had Michael as a teacher when you were in the senior part of the college. How was he as your teacher?
So I am a legal studies teacher and I'm an English teacher, and 2 of the reasons that I became a teacher are sitting here. So Michael, yes, Year 11 legal studies really opened up a fascination for me, and I of course pursued it, and that's what I teach today, as English did as well. So followed legal studies through Year 11 and 12 and then into university, and to become a teacher. So
And to come back to Mount Lilydale as a teacher in 91, I think it might have been. And
89.
89.
It's too long ago. I should
And
have started at 91.
And you taught with Michael. How was that? He was the team leader at that stage,
Yes.
I think. So how was that experience?
With Michael and Peter, with Peter Anderson, Year 11 legal studies and Year 12. So it was wonderful to come back and have a mentor like Michael and to teach legal studies. I have a passion for the subject. I love it. And I marked it, and I've written the paper and done a few other things with legal. So, and I continue to enjoy teaching it. So, but it's those Year 11 classes and discussing issues and looking at what's going on in the outside world. I think it's a fantastic subject to teach, as I do English, Patricia.
And you taught Natalie too?
No, Danielle.
Yeah, my sister.
Yeah. Right. And so you made a choice, like Michael did. Michael chose to send Amelia and Kieran to school here, and I had the pleasure of working with both of them. And then you chose to send your children here, and Michael was the teacher of Nicholas, definitely. So how was that, working with him and then bringing your children here and finding Michael teaching them?
I like Michael has said with Amelia and Kieran, this is the community. It's you wouldn't send your children here if you didn't trust the community and trust the values that it's based on. And my 3 children have had a wonderful and are still having a wonderful experience here. Nicholas rang me the other night to say he'd just walked out of his final tute and he's just about to finish an economics and finance degree at Monash. And I was talking to Michael not long ago, and I've always hoped that I had instilled a love of reading in my child or my children, and then Nicholas tells me that the most fantastic book that he's read all year was on the beginning of the GPD, the emergence of the GPD. That's not exciting, Michael.
But you were probably in one of the, if not the first class, one of the first classes I ever taught here, and the irony and the humour associated with the fact that Daniel was in the last class I ever taught here. Which I thought was, and I reminded me of that as I left the room that day.
Yeah, so because he's also doing economics as well. So I've lost both of them to the commerce, not to the English field.
It's a good thing. It's good. There's one other chapter Alison forgot to mention then, that during the course of her studies at uni, she would often call in at home and she'd have an assignment or something that I'd read or something else. And yeah, so that connection continued. And it's those things that, so I suppose regardless of whether she took up a career here at Mount Lilydale or not, that connection was well and truly there at that stage.
I do remember trying to corrupt Amelia when she was a baby by giving her hawthorn booties.
Yeah, I think that was your last visit.
Well, John Michael, you commenced here in Year 7,
I
quite
did.
a long time ago now.
1996, I think it was.
1996. And you came to a school where your father was a teacher. What was that experience like?
I loved it. I mean, Dad was pretty widely respected amongst the students. He didn't usually embarrass me, except for when he drove his red Datsun 120Y up and down the hill at 120 clicks an hour. But no, it was pretty good. he also offered my mother a sense of perspective. Dad was the counsellor here for many years, dealing with people that had a lot of challenges, students that had a lot of challenges. So whenever I was in trouble at home or I got in trouble at school and Mum was reasonably cranky with me, Dad could politely offer perspective to Mum as to how my behaviour may be compared with some of the people he saw in her classroom. So it certainly had its positives.
And you have often talked to me about how you gained a sense of empowerment from the way Michael was the leader here at the school. In what respect did he give
I
that
suppose
to you?
an incredible example of Michael and his empowering style of leadership was when our dear friend Peter Anderson was Year 12 coordinator. And Michael called me into his office one afternoon with my fellow college captain Jackie McCudden, and Peter was there, and Peter sort of outlined his diagnosis to us. It was a really difficult conversation because we had no idea what MND was, we didn't know how aggressive it was. Peter started telling us. I'd only recently been looking at his photos of his then recently born Eliza, and Peter turned to us and he said, "Look guys, I don't want to make this public, but it's very aggressive and I'm going to need your help." Still get a bit emotional thinking about it. I'm going to need your help this year, things like assemblies, really taking on more of a leadership role than you naturally probably thought you were going to have. And I remember in that moment the easiest thing for Michael to do would have been to say, "Look guys, this is going to be a really stressful year, so I'll take on those responsibilities. You were obviously much more experienced than we were and you could have done it on your ear." But Michael turned to us and said, "Guys, through the devastation of what's happening with Pete, this is an opportunity for you guys to grow. We're going to be here to support you every step of the way. Anything you need, come and talk to us. But we're here to support you, and you guys are going to step up this year and I'm really confident that you will." And I just thought that was an incredible test of faith to a bunch of 16-year-old kids during what was a really, really difficult time. And that goes to sum up Michael's leadership. And, you know, I was reflecting driving out here to Mount Liddell that it's interesting to note that two of the other great leaders that I've worked under in my last 10, 15 years, Lizzie Blanthorne and James Molino, have gone on to be leaders in their own fields of employment, and they were both students here and were both very close to Michael then and currently, and they would also say that in their lives now there was probably the biggest influence on leadership for them would be Michael.
It's quite a tribute to you, Michael.
It's a bit humbling, that one. He's been prone to exaggeration over time.
Oh, I don't think so.
I think we're actually quite an enhancer. So.
Okay. The point you raise about Peter Anderson, though, I think is a really good one. That period of time, you know, to me, in my memory, it was a short period that once he broke the news to us about his MND until the time he left. But as I go back and check his book and other things, there was a quite an extended period of time. He stayed until literally he could not walk and get around the place, didn't he? It was just, for an adult, it was a remarkable thing. As young people, I don't know how it came across to you, but it must have been something that's obviously stayed with you for a long period of time.
Yeah, it was incredible. I mean, I still reflect on Pete. I was 15 or 16 when I first met Pete, and it's now nearly 20 years later, and there would still be moments of my life when I'm going through difficult decisions that I need to make or through challenging times, and I'll just think to myself, well, if Pete was sitting over there in the corner, what would he or what would he be saying to me? Either, you know, in year 12 he would be saying it to me in a rather booming voice, and later on in life he would be saying it to me in a bit of a weaker voice, but the message was just as strong. And yeah, I often call on his incredible intellect, his sense of compassion, his sense of right and wrong. Michael and Peter were very similar leaders in their style. They taught us the value of being able to listen, taught us the value of respect, taught us the value of being firm but fair, but also never losing your sense of humour and always keeping a sense of perspective. And that's something that 20 years later we still live every day.
And as we see the whole campaign around Fight MND, it's sort of... Yeah.
It was interesting. I went to Neil Danaher's book launch last Thursday, and I took Lee and Eliza, and it was in the long room at the MCG. And Pete had his book launch in the Olympic room, right next door to where Neil's book launch was. And I think there was probably a bigger crowd at Pete's. There was certainly a big crowd at Neil's, but there was a bigger crowd at Pete's. And maybe I'm being biased. But Pete was a real pioneer for a disease that nobody knew about, but was incredibly aggressive. And Neil and Pete had so many similarities. I mean, we see just the incredible way Neil Danaher conducts himself and raises awareness and all of the stuff he does with Fight MND. Pete did exactly the same. Pete just did it 10 years earlier, bringing awareness to a disease nobody knew about.
Yeah, the things that you kept doing after Peter left school here, the fundraising, the things you organised, was amazing. So the impact he had on your life was obviously
Well, I think it was
powerful.
myself and all of our colleagues in Year 12 that year. I think there's an element of we felt we owed it to not only Pete, but we felt we owed it to Lee and Eliza because of what Pete had given us in that year level. I have thought countless times of if I got diagnosed with Pete's disease, what I would do. And I'd probably quit my job immediately. I'd go play golf until I couldn't walk anymore, and then I'd curl up in a ball and feel sorry for myself. Pete gave himself to us for that entire year level, despite the incredible circumstances he was going through. So I think our close connection, that we've remained close, I think we all feel as though we owe both Pete and his family a lot.
Now, you've stayed friendly with John, 18 years since you left school.
Don't say that.
Yeah.
Oh no.
How do you think I feel?
Crazy.
And so you're golf partners?
We do.
Yes, so
We've had a couple of hits over the years with Aidan Craney. And from my point of view, I just find that fantastic that we can connect in that way. And probably for these three around the table and others as well. There's something about the connection with the school. It wouldn't matter how long it's been since the last contact we've had, just that sense of being able to strike up a conversation as if it was only yesterday we saw each other.
And that's exactly what it's like on the golf course. I mean, you do spend 15 minutes. I mean, every time I see you, even though I've seen you more outside of school than the 6 years that I was in it, you still for the first 15 minutes have to try and get out of your head that you're not Mr. Johnston, the senior school coordinator. But we regularly have a hit and with some friends, and I'll never forget one story. One time I organised a game of golf with a couple of other mates, Aidan, as you mentioned, and Rob Aston.
That's right.
And Mr. Johnston, and I sent a group text message to them all saying 12:15 we're hitting off, and Michael's in good form because he's just come back from Old Head in Ireland, which is a beautiful course there. And Rob didn't realise it was a group text, and being a former student, I think he ended up teaching here as well. Rob sends a text message back, not realising it's a group text, saying that expletive, I can't believe he played there, I'm so jealous, expletive. And again, getting to this, like Rob was mortified when he realised Mr. Johnson was in on the text. And Mr. Johnson, being just the consummate professional, texted straight back, Rob, it was a great experience, Michael. And you know, we then spent 4 hours just talking about our families, our careers. It's, you know, often I'm playing with you and I'm picking on you, you're picking your brains for things that are going on in my world. How would you handle this? How would you handle that? And it's sort of like I'm still getting a teaching lesson, only I'm not paying any school fees. So it's quite good actually.
I'll send you the bill.
Natalie, you're the youngest member of this group, so you mark a second generation because your dad came to this school 1983 to 86.
Yeah, that's correct.
So do you want to, what was his feelings?
Dad was here from year 7 to year 10. Back in those days, he was keen to get out of school and to start. He has a business, Launch Fresh, and he created that, which is really amazing of what he did. So back then, school, you just had to do, and then you can just leave. So yeah.
Now, can you remember your first meeting with Mr. Johnston?
Mr. Johnston was always speaking at assemblies or masses. He was always someone you looked up to. And then in year 11, he was my economics teacher, and year 12, and it was an amazing experience. Every lesson was filled with social justice and talking about society, and yeah, it was awesome. It was really good.
So he emphasised the sacredness of every individual.
Every person. I don't think there was a lesson where we didn't talk about social justice, which was amazing.
It's interesting you say that because it's probably not something I go in with the intention of.
I think we just talk and we go on tangents, and yeah, classes with Mr. Johnston were awesome.
Yeah. I was lucky in that there were probably half a dozen kids in that class who were very socially aware and more than willing to pick up on the conversation.
And it just went everywhere.
Yeah.
So it became part of the narrative of your Mercy ethos because of the direction you went with the students, the feel you had for those students. And
probably, but as I said, it wasn't always an intentional thing.
No.
It wasn't like I was going in to teach, social justice unit 3 and 4. It was economics 3 and 4, but in the course of it, you just wove it in.
Yeah.
Well, you brought Julian Burnside out and he spoke, I think, when you were in Year 12, and
Yes.
I think that had a pretty profound effect on you, didn't it?
Yes, it did. So he talked about refugees and asylum seekers, and from that talk we then started a group while I was in Year 11, I think it was. And then we got to visit detainees in the Broadmeadows Detention Centre, which was a great experience, very eye-opening experience it was. And then from there in Year 12, I organised for every Year 12 student to write a letter to a detainee on Nauru Manus Island, which was an amazing opportunity I got through the school and Mr. Johnston and Mr. Layden. And then now I study law, so the social justice side just went straight through, which was awesome.
So you think back sometimes to the leadership that Michael gave in his classes?
Always, Mr. Johnston.
And earlier this year, I actually bumped into Nat
Yes.
at Ringwood Magistrates Court, and she wasn't appearing on any charges. She was there doing pro bono work,
Yep.
and that did not surprise me one iota. I assume that was part of your course, but I suspect you would have been doing it.
Well,
Whether it was-
I'm still doing it now, and even though I've completed all my hours, I love it there. So,
Now, since leaving school, Natalie, you've remained involved. You're a very strong member of the Old Collegians Association. Why is it important to you to keep up that connection with this school?
When I was at school, I loved every single moment of it. I loved going to school. So to keep that connection with the school is really important for me. I hope one day when I have kids, I'll be able to send them here, and I think it's the best school. It was for me anyway. So to keep coming here for Old Collegians events and meetings is really good.
And to what extent do you think Michael's leadership style, because he's supported the Old Collegians enormously too, and you saw him at events?
At the gala, a couple of years ago, Mr. Johnston was there interviewing people. So I think it's always, he taught us it's important to volunteer our time and to give back to others. So I think it's a really good way to stay connected and do that.
And Michael, you were yes, I'm putting it in the past tense. You were an enormous support to the Old Collegians. I suppose you've moved on to a different part of your life now. But why did you make that choice to so strongly support an Old Collegians Association here?
I think stewardship's probably the word to use. I think it's important to recognise the past, where the school's come from, but also that knowledge that I think it's incumbent upon each of us to make sure the place is a little bit better than it was when you first came. That's my view of stewardship, and I think through the Old Collegians there's that opportunity. We talk about people being connected with their school. There's a range of ways why I think it's important for people afterwards to try and maintain that connection as well. But I think it would revolve around that stewardship. I was lucky enough last year, I think there were 2 reunions held here last year. It scares me to say one of them was a 30-year reunion and the other was a 20-year reunion, I think. But as I spoke to people there, their memories of their time here at school were only positive. And they were even people who I thought at the time when they were at school were probably not model students. Were probably not model students, but they spoke highly of what the school gave them. And again, that's, I suppose, what you probably look for. And it's not until much later in life. I wouldn't think, you're the exception, I suspect, a couple of years out of school to be actively involved in the Old Collegians is a rarity. It's not until later that you come to appreciate for a range of reasons. And I think 20 and 30 years on, if people can still say that about the school they attended, I think that's a wonderful advertisement for the school.
And looking at the quality of people that Mount Ulladulla turn out, it's a real testament to all of the staff that have gone through here. But you've been here for how many years, did you say?
It was 38. Yeah.
38 years, and you look at the quality of people that have gone and the things that they've gone on to do, and so many of them have been through your leadership, also the leadership of many others. You've just created great people. Yes, you've created smart people and other people that have gone on that might not have been so academically smart and have gone on and done other things, but the culture of the people that have been delivered into the community through this college has just been outstanding, and I can only hope that our kids find a school that does exactly the same.
And I think that's something special about the mercy nature of the school. I speak to people who work in schools that don't have a particular religious order that's responsible for the school. In other words, they might just be a regional school, and they often tell me that it's harder to hang your hat, so to speak, on something if you haven't got that charism that goes with it. And I think the Mercy charism here, it's a very practical way. I think, as I say, we're compelled to act, and from a social justice point of view, that's obvious, and there's lots of ways that can and does happen. And that changes over time.